Hercule Poirot and the Echo of Footsteps in the Night, Chapter 1. The Echo in Villa Orphée. The mist spread like a ghostly veil over the immaculate gardens of Villa Orphée, a stately mansion on the edge of Lake Annecy, where echoes multiplied between the stone walls and hedges trimmed with almost mathematical precision. It was a moonless night, enveloped in a silence so absolute that footsteps became ominous. It was precisely an echo, dull and distant, that disturbed the serenity of that early morning. At 7:15 in the morning, the maid Claudine found the body. He was lying at the foot of the curved staircase in the east wing, his arms splayed like a broken marionette. The victim, Armand Valcourt, the celebrated retired philanthropist and owner of the villa. He was wearing a burgundy velvet dressing gown, and in his right hand he still clutched an antique rosary. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, except for a small stain of dried blood on his left temple. The local police were quick to suggest an accidental fall, but Madame Delphine, the deceased's younger sister, was not convinced. "My brother would never have walked at night without his slippers," she said, her voice tense, her lips pursed. "Even less so with the rosary in his hand. No, there's something wrong with all this." It was then that the letter arrived in Brussels. Murder disguised as an accident, Hastings. Don't you find that intriguing? Of course, Poirot. But the local prefect is convinced that Monsieur Valcourt slipped. Advanced age, a waxed floor. Isn't that the most logical conclusion? Poirot elegantly interlaced his fingers and placed the pads under his chin. Logical? Perhaps. Satisfactory? Never. The human soul, mon ami, does not slip without leaving traces in the logic of crime. And Mademoiselle Delphine, she has that feeling of foreboding that I do not despise. Let's pack up, Hastings. Thus, with the meticulous efficiency that characterized the little Belgian detective, they set off for Villa Orphée. On the night train to Annecy, Poirot reviewed the few pieces of information available, as if already drawing invisible lines between future suspicions. A pious, reserved man, with a respectable fortune and a very limited inner circle. Nothing seemed unusual, except the footsteps. Upon their arrival, the scene at Villa Orphée was anything but chaotic. The police had already left, and the local doctor had certified the cause of death as accidental head trauma. However, Poirot, in his impeccable pearl grey suit, inspected the staircase with a hawk's eye. "Look, Hastings, there's no spatter. The body fell forward, but the wound is on the left. How do you explain that?" "Maybe it spun as it fell," Hastings ventured. "Perhaps," Poirot repeated without conviction. Then his eyes fell on the carpet on the first step. "And look, no wrinkles. No one slipped here last night." In the living room, the house's residents were waiting for them. Madame Delphine, with a stern face and black mourning dress. Lucien, the young artist nephew, with an absent air. Madame Fournier, the housekeeper with a harsh voice and aloof gaze, and the unexpected guest, Monsieur Gabriel Darnay, a former partner of Valcourt's who had arrived 2 days before the crime. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot," Delphine said with a sigh. "I need to know the truth. Something tells me that night it wasn't a fall. I heard footsteps, and then silence. A different kind of silence." "Different how, mademoiselle?" "As if someone had stopped breathing." Poirot nodded slowly. "My little grey cells are very interested, mademoiselle, and when they are interested, the truth soon reveals itself." Thus began the investigation. The echo of footsteps in the night wasn't just a sound, it was a footprint, a signal, and Hercule Poirot, with his impeccable logic and keen ear for the nuances of the human soul, had already begun to hear what others couldn't. Chapter 2. A House Full of Echoes. Breakfast at Villa Orphée passed in a tense atmosphere where even the clinking of the china seemed excessively loud. Poirot, with his usual composure, observed each person present with that polite but implacable scrutiny that unnerved so many nerves. Hastings, meanwhile, savoured his coffee, paying more attention to the atmosphere than to the beverage. Lucien Valcourt, with his languid gaze and fingers stained with dried paint, helped himself to a slice of bread without enthusiasm. Opposite him, Gabriel Darnay was flipping through the newspaper without really reading it. Madame Delphine kept her gaze fixed on a tiny crack in the table, while Madame Fournier hadn't deigned to sit down, hovering like a crow among the cups and saucers. "Were you all at the villa on the night of Monsieur Valcourt's death?" Poirot asked gently, placing his cup down with mathematical precision on its saucer. "Yes," Delphine replied. "Lucien and I were in our rooms. Monsieur Darnay retired early, and Madame Fournier, as always, she made sure to turn off the lights and lock the back door. And no one heard anything. Not a scream, not a shout, not a falling object." Lucien raised his eyes briefly. "I heard something. Not a scream, more like a loud bang. I thought maybe it was the wind, a loose shutter." "I heard footsteps," Delphine added. "Not my brother's. He was dragging his right foot a little. These were different, lighter, and then—" Silence. Poirot nodded slowly. His attention shifted to Madame Fournier, who finally interrupted her rounds to speak. "I didn't hear anything, monsieur. I retired to my room after midnight." The house was quiet. "And how did you know it was calm?" The woman looked at him, somewhat bewildered. "Well, I didn't hear anything unusual. Ah, mais oui. But sometimes silence isn't tranquillity. It's concealment, don't you think?" The comment seemed to leave a bitter aftertaste in the air, although Poirot accompanied it with a polite smile. Later, Poirot asked Hastings to accompany him on a tour of the property. The staircase where the body was found descended from an internal gallery connected to the library. Halfway up, a large window let in the morning light. Despite the post-incident cleaning, Poirot examined each step as if revealing secrets. "Do you notice anything, Hastings?" "Nothing obvious, although I find it curious that there are no marks. If Mr. Valcourt had fallen from above, he would have hit more than one step." "Exactly, and yet the blood only appeared near the last stretch. Hastings, what do we deduce from that? That maybe he was already unconscious before he fell?" Poirot nodded, pleased. "Or that it was placed there, later. In both scenarios, we have a lie wrapped in truth." Poirot knelt with great effort, a rarity for him, and ran a finger under the handrail. Dust. But on the lower flight, right near where the body fell, the dust seemed to have been recently brushed away. Someone knocked here after the crime, maybe to make sure their job was done right. In the library, Poirot stopped in front of an oil portrait of Armand Valcourt. The man in the painting had the same rosary between his fingers as his corpse. It was a detail that seemed out of place. "Devout, even in death," Poirot murmured. But his religion was private, reserved, and yet we found him with the most conspicuous symbol in his hand. Hastings. That was no coincidence. Are you suggesting that someone placed it there to give the impression that he was praying? Oui. And that, my friend, is theatrical. When a murderer dramatizes a scene, it's not by accident. It's to tell us something, or to distract us. That afternoon, Poirot asked to speak privately with Gabriel Darnay. He invited him into the drawing-room, where the evening light fell golden on the antique furniture. "When was the last time you spoke to Monsieur Valcourt?" asked Poirot. "The very night of his death. We chatted briefly in the study. He told me he was tired and would be retiring early. I didn't notice anything unusual. And the reason for your visit to the villa? Old scores to settle. I was his partner in an investment fund years ago. We had our differences, but there were rumors he wanted to write a new will. I thought maybe he'd forgive me." Poirot watched him with keen attention. "And do you think he did it?" "I don't know. He went to sleep before I could ask him. The next day he was dead. A very unfortunate event, monsieur. Are you implying something, Poirot?" "Nothing yet. But the ghosts of resentment, Monsieur Darnay, often walk with very real steps." Darnay swallowed. Poirot, meanwhile, had already begun to form his mental map of contradictions. A theatrical rosary. A fall without logic. Silence before the blow. And footsteps that were not the dead man's. The echo in the night was not a hallucination. It was a key, and Hercule Poirot was already beginning to hear its true meaning. Chapter 3. The Truths That Are Not Told. The third day at Villa Orphée dawned, with a thick fog drifting through the garden trees like a persistent whisper. Poirot, already neatly dressed in a light grey pinstriped suit and pale green tie, headed for the greenhouse, where, according to Madame Delphine, Lucien used to spend his mornings painting. Hastings followed him, bundled up and suspicious. "Dinde, you think the boy is hiding something, Poirot? My friend, everyone is hiding something. The question is how relevant what they're hiding is to the crime. Omission is an elegant form of lying, and in this case, I suspect elegance abounds." Lucien was leaning over a canvas, his eyes squinting, as if searching for something invisible within it. His palette displayed a range of sombre tones, greys, moss greens, and faded browns. Beside him, an antique radio murmured a Debussy sonata. "I'm interrupting your inspiration, Monsieur Valcourt," said Poirot gently. Lucien looked up, unsurprised. His dark, distant eyes betrayed no emotion. "No, not at all. Sometimes silence is more inspiring than any music." "Precisely," said Poirot, sitting delicately on a wooden bench. "This house is full of silences, monsieur. Some are natural, and some are manufactured." Lucien put away the palette. "If you're here to ask me if I killed my uncle, you can save your time." "I didn't," Poirot smiled politely. "Oh, I never ask that. That would be too direct. I prefer to understand. For example, why did you leave Paris 3 months ago, when you were about to open an exhibition?" Lucienne hesitated for a fraction of a second. Out of exhaustion. Creative crisis. But, according to a review of the art journal, your Blind Eyes series was promising. Wasn't that what led to a dispute with your dealer? Have you been investigating me? I always investigate before I make inferences. It's a little principle of mine. Lucien looked away. My uncle offered me a place to stay and rest. I'm not ambitious, Monsieur Poirot, not like some people. Others like Monsieur Darnay. Lucien visibly tensed. Poirot didn't press the issue, but took note of the gesture. One last thing, the detective said as he stood up. Did you know your uncle was planning to change his will? I suspected as much, although he never confirmed it. Thank you, sir. Have a creative day. Poirot returned to the house, but he didn't go to the living room or his bedroom. Instead, he knocked on the kitchen door, where Madame Fournier was cleaning a pile of cutlery with the concentration of a surgeon. The woman jumped slightly when she saw him. Another question, Monsieur Poirot? No, just a conversation. They say you've served in this house for more than 20 years. You knew Mr. Valcourt well. Since he was young. He was a difficult man, but a fair one. Did you have enemies? All rich men have them, though they don't always acknowledge them. But my master was harsher on his own family than on outsiders. Poirot leaned slightly towards her. Towards your nephew? The woman dried her hands on her apron, uncomfortable. He had expectations. He wanted Lucien to abandon art and join the estate management. He said painting was for dishonourable bohemians. And what about your sister, Madame Delphine? She was always his shadow, dependent. He owed her everything. That's why I don't think she had anything to do with his death. I wouldn't dream of it. Poirot bowed his head in thanks and left. That afternoon, Poirot asked to see Valcourt's office, which had not been entered since the crime. With Delphine present, he opened drawers, looked through papers, and finally found a folder labelled Testamentary Modifications, but the interior was empty. Curious, Poirot murmured. Madame, did you know about this document? No, she said, but a week ago he and Gabriel had an argument. I remember hearing agitated voices, and then silence. My brother stormed out. He said he'd made a mistake. He'd regret. Poirot frowned. Those kinds of errors are not usually accounting errors. No, they were personal. Gabriel was more than a partner, Monsieur Poirot. At one time, he was almost like a son to Armand. Poirot paused for a moment. And what happened? I never knew for sure. But after that trip to Tunisia, something broke between them. Poirot closed the empty folder. Crimes aren't born overnight, madame. They're brewing in long silences, like the ones you hear through these walls. Back in his room, Poirot sat in front of the fire with a small notebook. On the first page, he wrote a single word. Reason, and below he listed precisely Lucien. Inheritance at stake, artistic resentment. Gabriel, financial breakup, recent argument. Delphine, total dependence or jealousy. Fournier, old loyalty or obligation. Poirot closed the notebook. Footsteps, in the night, Hastings, aren't just a sound. They're a metaphor for a wandering soul, perhaps a guilty one. And this house has too many wandering souls. Chapter 4. A Letter on the Fireplace. Night fell over Villa Orfe like a heavy blanket, slowly dulling the garden's colours and transforming the stained-glass windows into blind eyes. Inside, the atmosphere had become even denser, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets too long suppressed. Poirot, standing in front of the fireplace in the main hall, watched the flames dance with the patience of someone waiting for the fire to reveal a buried truth. Hastings entered with a worried expression. "Isn't it dangerous to be snooping around like that in the middle of the night, Poirot? Crime, my friend, never sleeps, and neither do answers. This house has begun to speak, Hastings. We just need to listen carefully." He suddenly bent down and, with his silver tweezers, extracted a partially charred piece of paper from the ashes. He placed it on a metal tray and examined it under the lamp. "Look at this," he murmured. "Fragments of a letter, handwritten." Hastings leaned forward to look. Although most of the contents were destroyed, a few sentences survived. "Can't bear this guilt. Lucien must not know. If something happens to me, look in the portrait." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. The letter was written by Armand. Look at his handwriting. Angular, nervous, unlike his official signature. It was written in a hurry. But why destroy it? And who did it? Are you suggesting it wasn't Valcourt himself? I don't think so. If he feared for his life, he would have hidden it, not burned it. Someone else did it. Someone who didn't want this confession to reach us. Poirot stored the remains with great care. "Hastings, we won't get much sleep tonight." The next morning, Poirot asked to examine the portrait gallery again. There hung, in a symmetrical arrangement, the Valcourt genealogy, generations of austere faces, inquisitive gazes, but the most recent painting, the one of Armand, had a peculiarity. Do you see this, Hastings? The frame has a dent at the top. It's not from time. It's recent. Gently, Poirot removed the portrait from the wall. Behind it, in a barely perceptible gap, he found a small wooden box with a bronze clasp. He opened it carefully. Inside were two objects, a folded letter and a bank receipt. The letter was brief, written in the same handwriting as the burned fragment. In it, Armand confessed to having changed his will just 3 days before his death, eliminating Lucien as his primary heir and leaving everything to a cultural foundation run by Gabriel Darnay. The reason: Lucien has squandered every opportunity. I offered him. He needs to learn the value of what was lost. Poirot handed the document to Hastings with a grave face. "And here we have a human contradiction, Hastings. Punishing a nephew for not following the path laid out, and rewarding the partner who once betrayed him. Is it justice or repentance? So, Gabriel had a motive to kill him, or to hide the fact that she had forgiven him. But listen, the important thing here isn't just the content, but its existence. This letter had to disappear, and someone made sure of it. What they didn't know is that Armand was more forward-thinking than they were." Poirot asked everyone in the house to meet in the library at 5 o'clock. No one protested. It was clear that the tension had reached a point where even silence hurt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began calmly, "a crime has been committed in this house. A crime disguised as an accident with remarkable subtlety. But there is something the murderer failed to consider, that even a footstep in the night, even an echo, can lead us to him. They all looked at each other uneasy. Last night I found a letter on the mantelpiece. Today I found another one behind Mr. Valcourt's portrait. Both were written by him, and both reveal intentions very different from what we've been given. Delphine put a hand to her chest. A letter. Yes, mademoiselle. Your brother was afraid, and someone tried to turn that fear into silence. Poirot took out the bank receipt. It was dated 2 days before the death. It was a deposit in the name of Gabriel Darnay for a substantial sum. "Do you explain this, monsieur?" asked Poirot, without raising his voice. Gabriel sat up straight, his face as white as marble. That was a refund. Armand was returning part of an old investment to me. It has nothing to do with his death. Maybe, but his will names you as a beneficiary. Doesn't that seem like a fortunate coincidence? I didn't know about the will, Gabriel exclaimed. I swear. So who burned the letter? Asked Poirot, with a quick glance at the rest. Silence. Poirot took a deep breath and adjusted his shirt cuffs. I'm not looking for a confession today, just a reaction. Because in reactions, ladies and gentlemen, lies the unspoken truth. That evening, Poirot reflected quietly as he walked with Hastings through the gardens. Someone felt betrayed. Someone saw the will as a judgment. And someone didn't measure their fury. And what shall we do now? Watch, listen, and wait for the killer to stumble upon his own lies. Because when the truth isn't told, it always leaves an echo. Chapter 5. The witness who doesn't speak. The fog had dissipated, but the atmosphere at Villa Orphée remained charged with uncertainty. The faces of those present moved cautiously through the corridors, as if a prolonged gaze might reveal more than was appropriate. Poirot, however, walked serenely, his steps measured, his moustache immaculate as ever. Hastings, with a notebook in hand, read in a low voice. So, Gabriel received money. Lucien was disinherited. Delphine heard footsteps, and someone burned a letter. Oui, Hastings. And that letter was clumsily burned. Like all desperate acts, they entered the music room, a space rarely used except by Claudine, the maid, who often cleaned there. They found the young woman dusting an old piano. Ah, Mademoiselle Claudine, said Poirot with a friendly smile. Just a moment, if I may. She stopped immediately. Monsieur Poirot? I've noticed that you move very discreetly around the house, and that in times like these makes a maid a privileged witness. I don't know if I saw anything, she replied, visibly nervous. You don't need to know. You just need to remember. Did you go into the east wing that night? Yes, but only to close the windows as usual. And did you see anything out of place? Claudine hesitated. There was a scarf on the floor, red silk, at the foot of the stairs. But when I came back at dawn, it was gone. Red silk? Are you sure? Completely. And it had embroidery in one corner, like a fleur-de-lis. Poirot exchanged a quick glance with Hastings. Thank you, mademoiselle. That was very helpful. Back in the living room, Poirot sat down in his favourite armchair, crossed his legs and touched his chin thoughtfully. A silk scarf. Hastings, do you remember what Monsieur Lucien was wearing when we met him? An open neck, sweater, and a red scarf. Exactly. And although she hasn't used it since her uncle's death, there was a grey one hanging in her room. Not a red one. Where's the other one? Do you think Lucien hid her? Or someone else found it, and Didier got rid of it? Poirot stood up again. Let's go to his studio. Lucien's studio was in a less travelled wing of the house. On a table lay several covered canvases. Poirot removed the cloth from one. It was an incomplete portrait of a faceless man. The figure was wrapped in a burgundy robe, and in his hand dangled a rosary. "My God!" exclaimed Poirot. "Hastings, do you see that? It's Armand Valcourt, painted dead." Poirot examined the painting carefully. The pose was almost identical to the one the body had at the foot of the stairs, but the background was different. "Look," Poirot pointed out, "there's no ladder. You're standing in front of a mirror, and in the reflection there's a blurred figure. Who paints a dead man next to his reflection? An artist obsessed with death, or one who saw more than he wants to admit?" At that moment the door opened without warning. Lucien watched them with blazing eyes. "Who gave you permission to touch my things? Sir, your painting is revealing." "I didn't mean to show it. It's catharsis, personal art. That doesn't prove anything." "No, but it reveals a lot. You saw your uncle die, or you arrived seconds later, and you painted him, not with imagined details, but with what you actually saw." Lucien trembled for a moment. "I didn't hurt him, if that's what you think. I just found him like this. I couldn't move him. I just wanted to remember Poirot didn't interrupt him. He let him speak. I heard the fall. I ran from my study, and there she was, head tilted, rosary in hand. I didn't scream. I didn't know what to do. I just watched, as if she could still speak to me. And the scarf." Lucien pressed his lips together. "I don't know what you're talking about. A witness saw it at the scene, red with a fleur-de-lis. Hers?" Lucien lowered his head. He had lent it to someone. "Whom?" "Gabriel. He said he felt cold that night, but I didn't think—" Poirot nodded. "It doesn't matter what you thought, just what happened." Back in his room, Poirot walked with slow, silent steps. The case was coming together. Pieces were beginning to fall into place. The change of will, the burned letter, the missing scarf, the figure in the mirror, the light footsteps, and above all, a portrait painted in secret, where the reflection in the background was perhaps not a metaphor, but a real witness. Painting. And doesn't lie, Hastings. Men do, and there was still the biggest lie to be discovered. Chapter 6. The Reflection in the Mirror. The afternoon fell with a heavy melancholy over Villa Orphée. The sky was covered with opaque clouds, as if the house itself had absorbed too much tension. Poirot, oblivious to the gloomy atmosphere, walked down the East Wing corridor with the expression of someone carrying a puzzle in his mind, of which only 2 or 3 crucial pieces were missing. "The mirror," he murmured. "Always the mirror." "What do you mean, Poirot?" Hastings asked, struggling to keep up. "The portrait of Lucien, mon ami. The blurred reflection on the canvas. It's not decorative. It's an intentional detail. A memory silently captured. Lucien, as an artist, portrayed what he saw. And in the reflection, there's someone else. Someone present at the moment of death. And do you think that person can be identified? Poirot stopped in front of the staircase. He looked up at the gallery. Then he looked down at the steps that led to the exact spot where Armand Valcourt had been found. Maybe not because of his face, but because of his attitude, because of what he did next. The killer tried to stage a fall. He used the rosary as an emotional distraction, and he burned a letter that put everything at risk. He wanted to silence the dead man, Hastings, but he forgot that reflexes sometimes scream louder. Later, Poirot asked to examine Armand's private study, to which Delphine had the key. She agreed without resistance, although with visible discomfort. "My brother barely used it anymore," she murmured. "Ever since Gabriel came back into our lives, he preferred to talk business in the garden or the library." "And you approved of this renewed friendship?" Delphine looked down. Gabriel was a shadow of his past. When he left, my brother fell into a deep bitterness. But when he returned, he seemed like a different man. Optimistic, more generous. I never believed in that change. Poirot watched her for a moment with his penetrating eyes. "Did you know about the New Testament?" "I just had a feeling. My brother wasn't an easy man to read, but the way he'd been talking lately, as if everything had already been decided, made me think the worst." Poirot nodded. "Thank you, miss." Inside the study, a small room with wallpapered walls and a crystal chandelier hanging like a suspended jewel, Poirot searched for something more subtle than papers or receipts. He stopped in front of a low cabinet, the back of which was adorned with an oval mirror. "Look at this, Hastings. Do you notice anything peculiar?" "Just my reflection, Poirot." "Exactly. But if you stand at this angle—" He positioned himself to the left of the mirror, his back to the desk. The reflection shows the hallway and part of the stair landing. Hastings remained silent. "Are you suggesting that Armand saw the killer through this mirror? That, or the killer thought he was hiding and didn't notice that his presence would be reflected in someone's presence? Perhaps Armand himself, before going to sleep." Poirot leaned over a side table. There were circular marks left by a drink, still fresh. He took a small glass flask from the nearby ashtray and smelled it. Cognac and something else. Something metallic. Poison? Maybe, but not enough to kill immediately. Which brings me to a question. Was Armand weakened before the fall? Back in the main drawing room, Poirot asked everyone to gather again. This time, no one feigned surprise. There was a tense expectation in the air. Delphine, Lucien, Gabriel, and Madame Fournier silently took their seats. Claudine remained discreetly in the doorway. Poirot stood up slowly. "I've reconstructed the last minutes of Monsieur Valcourt's life. The killer was close, very close, and he left invisible traces that nevertheless reveal much." Gabriel frowned. "Are you implying—" "I'm stating that the crime wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, calmly. The motive was the change of will, the method, a mixture of emotional and physical manipulation, and the scene, carefully altered to simulate an accidental death. And what proof do you have? Lucien asked tensely. Poirot raised a hand elegantly. The portrait, monsieur. You painted your dead uncle and someone else in the reflection. That detail is essential. Lucien paled. I didn't remember painting it. Your subconscious did. The image you captured wasn't an invention. It was an impression. You saw or felt that there was another. Poirot turned to Madame Fournier. You, Madame, said you didn't hear anything that night. But how could you know the house was quiet if you were in your room, on the other side? The woman hesitated. I guessed so, like every night. It was part of my routine. But that night wasn't like any other, was it? Someone used your key to get into the study. Someone who knew Armand drank alone before bed. Someone who knew where the poison was. Fournier took a step back. Delphine looked at her in disbelief. Poirot, however, did not raise his voice. I'm not ready to accuse anyone yet, but I'm getting close. And I assure you, in this house, someone made a mistake. One as subtle as the reflection of a face in a mirror. Silence fell. Only the slight creaking of the wood beneath Claudine's feet broke the stillness. Poirot turned around slowly, looking at each of the people present one by one. The truth is here. I just have to ask the right question. And someone will give themselves away. And with that, the Belgian detective left the room. The echo of his footsteps resonated through the halls like a clock approaching its final moment. Chapter 7. The Contradiction of the Keys. At dawn, the next day, a dry wind swept across the path that connected the villa to the small jetty at the edge of the lake. Poirot, standing by the water, stared at the distorted reflection of the clouds, as if searching the surface for the image of something that could only be revealed upside down. Hastings, half drowsy, approached, coats in hand. I didn't know we were having a field trip this morning, he murmured. It's not a field trip, mon ami. It's an exercise in clarity. Sometimes distancing yourself from the scene allows you to see the essential, like a painting that's better understood from a distance. And have you seen something that we missed? Poirot nodded slightly. A key. A key. Exactly. All the doors at Villa Orphée require a key, even the interior ones. Armand Valcourt was a man of order. And yet, on the night of the crime, the study was open. According to Madame Fournier, she had locked it at dusk, as she did every day. And who else had a copy? Just 4 people. Fournier herself, Delphine, Gabriel. At tea time, Poirot asked to speak privately with Madame Delphine. He found her in the greenhouse, surrounded by azaleas and ferns. The air was full of moisture and vegetal fragrance, and on her lap, as so often, lay a book she wasn't reading. Mademoiselle, pardon my intrusion, she nodded politely. I don't mind, Monsieur Poirot. Imagine, after all, you've done what the local police would never have considered. Poirot sat opposite her, slowly crossing his legs. I have one last question, and it's perhaps the most important. Tell me, why didn't you do anything when you learned Gabriel was near Armand that night? You suspected it. You hinted as much to me. Why didn't you act? Delphine took a deep breath. Then, finally, she put the book aside. Because I didn't want to. Because it wasn't my crime. But it was my decision. Poirot looked at her without interrupting. My brother was a tyrant disguised as a philanthropist. All his life he used me as a shield, as a secretary, as an emotional maid. I tolerated him. I even protected him. But when I learned he planned to leave his entire fortune to Gabriel, the same man who betrayed him years before, who publicly humiliated him in Tunisia, I understood that I didn't want to save him. So, you let him die. I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot, but I didn't save him. I saw Gabriel enter his study. I heard the muffled argument. I recognized the sound of breaking glass. And then, silence. A silence I knew well. A final silence. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. And then he lit the lamp, prepared for his evening as usual, and waited for someone to find the body. Delphine nodded calmly. It was my way of coming out, of ceasing to be a shadow. Does that make me guilty? Poirot watched her for a long time. Then he stood up. That's not for me to judge. But know this, you weren't the murderer. It was something more complex. You were the last echo of a life that no one wanted to hear. That night, Poirot and Hastings were packing up in their rooms. Outside, the sky was clearing for the first time in days, revealing a bright, round moon. I didn't think this case would affect me so much, Hastings said as he folded his clothes. But there was something deeply human about all this. It wasn't just a crime. It was an explosion that had been contained for years. Poirot, sitting by the window, nodded. The worst crimes aren't those of blood, Hastings. They're those of the soul, and here each one carried their own silent crime on their shoulders. Do you think Delphine will suffer the consequences? In a way, you've already suffered them, all your life. And now, you'll have to live with the decision of having chosen silence. Poirot got up, turned off the bedside lamp, and muttered before going to bed. At Villa Orphée, footsteps no longer echo, but the unspoken words will continue to resonate for a long time. Chapter 10. The Last Reflection. The day of departure dawned with a clear sky over Villa Orphée, as if the weather, after days of uncertainty and suspicion, was offering a respite. The garden was bathed in the golden light of the early sun, and the air smelled of damp earth and freshly fallen leaves. Poirot, always punctual, had already laid out his suitcases in the hall. Hastings, a little later, was coming down the stairs, with a thoughtful expression. Ready to return to London, Poirot? Physically, yes, but my mind still wanders these halls. There's one more thing I must do before I say goodbye. The fact that Poirot didn't reply. Instead, he walked over to the portrait of Armand Valcourt in the library. He looked at it for a few seconds and then pulled it back from the wall. Behind it, where the will had once been hidden, was now only a small sheet of paper taped up. "What's that?" Hastings asked, coming closer. Poirot delicately peeled off the note and read it silently. Then he handed it to Hastings. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Delphine, don't condemn me. I didn't save my brother, but I didn't push him away either. I just let his world fall apart, like you've so often let mine fall apart. May this house finally be filled with truth. Diff." Poirot carefully put the paper in his notebook. A final gesture. Not a confession, but an acceptance. Mademoiselle Delphine understood that justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it hides in invisible decisions, like the one not to intervene. And do you think he did the right thing? Poirot looked at him gravely. It's not a question of right or wrong. It's a question of truth and consequences. No one here came out unscathed. Not even the guilty party. While they waited for the car that would take them to the station, Claudine approached to say goodbye. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers and wore a serene expression, unlike the restlessness that had characterized her days before. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, not only for uncovering the truth, but for making me see that observing is also an act of courage. Poirot smiled at him. You were the first to speak about what you saw. Without your words, the echoes would still resonate in the darkness. Truth, mademoiselle, is the child of detail and courage. Lucien also appeared shortly after. His face was haggard, but something in his bearing had changed. He was dressed simply, without scarves or ornaments, and he carried a linen cloth wrapped in thick paper under his arm. Monsieur Poirot, I want you to have this. Poirot took it carefully and unwrapped it. It was a new painting, not the portrait, of death, but a different one. The drawing-room at the Villa Orphée, bathed in morning light, with figures barely hinted at in the armchairs, and in the background a mirror. Reflected in it was Poirot, standing, one eyebrow raised. This is unexpected. It's the only way I can thank you, and close this chapter. Thank you, Mr. Lucien. And remember, art, when it's sincere, also solves mysteries. Finally, the car arrived. Hastings stowed the suitcases, and Poirot sat down elegantly, taking out his pocket watch to check the exact time. We've closed another case, Poirot, Hastings said, as the vehicle began to move forward. Yes, but not just any one. This one wasn't solved with fingerprints or weapons, but with silence, with reflections, and with decisions made in the dark. Do you think Delphine will ever be the same again? Poirot shook his head gently. No, but perhaps for the first time she'll be herself, without her brother's shadow, without the burden of silence. The road led away from the villa, which was fading away like a sepia-toned memory. The windows reflected the sunlight, and for a moment Hastings thought he saw a figure on one of the balconies. It was Delphine, motionless, upright, staring without moving her hand, as if, finally, she were alone in her own home. Poirot, without looking back, said in a low voice, "There are houses that keep secrets, and others that transform them into echoes. Villa Orphée, it was both." And with that, the car disappeared around the bend in the road, leaving behind the footsteps and echoes that had finally found rest. Chapter 11. Epilogue in the Shadows. Several weeks had passed since Poirot and Hastings had left the silent corridors of the Villa Orphée. News of the case had spread like a thick mist through the inner circles of French high society. Philanthropist dies under mysterious circumstances. Belgian detective reveals betrayal and complicit silence. But the press, as always, only scratched the surface. In his apartment on the Rue des Champs-Élysées in Paris, Poirot was reviewing his morning correspondence with his usual discipline. The kettle was steaming, and on the table was the portrait Lucien had given him, now beautifully framed and hanging on the wall opposite the desk. Hastings, visiting, was leafing through a British newspaper, but kept an eye on the painting. "I can't help looking at that mirror, Poirot, the one Lucien painted. There's something disturbing about it." Poirot smiled without taking his eyes off a letter in his hands. "That, Hastings, is because it represents something not often seen. The moment when truth and lies coexist. The reflection isn't just visual, it's psychological. In that painting, Lucien captured the soul of the house and of the crime. And yet he didn't do it consciously. Ah, but that's what great artists are like. They captivate more than they think." He placed the letter on the table and took a sip of tea. Then he raised an eyebrow. "A note from Claudine. Look, she's found a new job in Lyon. A bourgeois family with 3 children and a decent library. She says she still dreams of the marble staircase, but she no longer feels fear, only respect. I'm glad. He deserves it. Oui, courage isn't always loud, Hastings. Sometimes it's evident in the details. A spoken word, a quiet observation, a key returned to its place. Claudine had that courage. While others remained silent out of pride or self-interest, she spoke. Poirot stood up and walked to the window. Paris stretched out before him like a constantly shifting mosaic. "And what happened to Delphine?" Hastings asked. Poirot turned slowly. "I received a letter, a short one. It just said, 'I have begun to live.' And it was dated Marseille. Marseille? Change of scenery." Perhaps he finally understood that the only way to leave behind a house full of echoes is to find a place where no one recognizes your silence. That same day, Poirot received a visit from an old acquaintance. Inspector Jules, Berthier of the Sûreté. Tall, thin, and angular, Berthier had a reputation for being meticulous and suspicious. Although he held a certain respect for Poirot, even if he didn't openly admit it. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted with a slight bow, "I just wanted to let you know that the Villa Orphée case has been officially closed." Has Gabriel confessed? Indirectly. He doesn't deny it, and he doesn't justify it. He says it was a desperate impulse, too great a humiliation. But he doesn't try to defend himself. He believes what he did was inevitable. Poirot nodded, his face impassive. "That word has always intrigued me. Inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, Inspector. It only becomes so when you decide not to choose otherwise. And Miss Valcourt?" "She wasn't charged," Berthier said after a pause, "although you and I know she knew more than she said. The prosecution found no evidence of complicity, and the public story needs a more clear ending. Oh, but of course, the public always prefers a simple conclusion, even if the truth had more layers than an onion." Berthier smiled faintly and left with a curt bow. Poirot remained silent for a few minutes. As night fell, he lit a small lamp and took out a blank sheet of paper. With his fountain pen, he wrote slowly. The Villa Orphée case wasn't a murder in the classic sense. It was a chain of decisions, an accumulation of resentments, cultivated silences, and small, ignored gestures. The crime, in reality, was shared, not in execution, but in intention. And it is that, more than blood, that turns a house into a mausoleum of secrets. He signed the note and put it in an envelope marked simply, "For personal archives." Then he looked at his watch, smoothed his moustache, and said softly, "One more cup of tea, Hastings, and tomorrow, a new case. The world doesn't stop turning just because a crime has found its final echo." And in the stillness of his Parisian office, amidst soft shadows and orderly thoughts, Hercule Poirot closed the chapter with the elegance of someone who has seen the worst of the human soul, and yet he still believes in the truth. Chapter 12. The Final Echo. Days after Inspector Berthier's visit, Poirot's Paris apartment returned to its usual rhythm. The Swiss clock ticked with exquisite punctuality. The orchids on the windowsill received their exact dose of mineral water, and the soles of the detective's shoes traced the same path on the Persian carpet without a single deviation. But an unspoken conclusion hung in the air, a reflection yet to be uttered, until that afternoon, when Poirot, after a long pause over his tea, looked at Hastings with unusual intensity. "My friend, the time has come to close the true circle." "What do you mean?" Poirot stood up and went to a small wooden box, opened it, and took out an object that Hastings instantly recognized, the rosary that he found in Armand Valcourt's hand. "This," said Poirot, holding it up between two fingers, "was the most obvious, and therefore the most suspicious." "But didn't you say it was a dramatization of the crime?" "I thought so, but I was wrong. Partially. It was planted deliberately, but not by the killer. Wasn't it Gabrielle?" Poirot shook his head. "No, it was Delphine." Hastings looked at him in puzzlement. "She placed the rosary after the crime?" "Exactly." "He entered the scene minutes after the fall, saw his brother still alive, dying but conscious, and gave him what he'd always held up as a symbol of his redemption. It wasn't an act of manipulation. It was the gesture of someone who, in his own way, decided to forgive. And then he left. He left the body there without warning anyone, allowing the crime to continue its course toward chaos." "And how are you so sure?" Poirot approached the desk and took out a second note, hidden until then. "Because he told me to. He left this in my mailbox this morning." The note, written in blue ink in firm handwriting, read, "I couldn't help it. I didn't want to save him, but I didn't want to hate him to the end. I gave him the rosary. I gave him the only thing he still recognized as his. Then I let him go. He didn't deserve my intervention, only my silence." Signed simply D. Hastings remained silent, frowning. So, Delphine knew everything? Yes. He didn't just know, he accepted it. He chose not to intervene. His punishment was to live a lifetime of subservience. His redemption was to cease acting. And that doesn't make her an accomplice. Of what, Hastings? Of not calling in time? Of not reporting what she felt? In the legal code, perhaps. But in the code of the soul, she'd already served her time. Poirot reverently put the rosary back in its box. The real ending isn't the caïnhé, arrest of the culprit, nor the confession, nor the trial. The real ending is the moment when everything falls into place in your mind. And in this case, that moment has arrived. Weeks later, Poirot travelled alone to Annecy, not to investigate, but to close the loop. He visited the cemetery where Armand Valcourt lay. The tombstone was sober, A man of principles, Poirot placed a white flower on the grave and stood in silence. He didn't pray. He didn't reflect aloud. He just looked at the mountains in the background, covered in early snow, and listened. There were no footsteps. There were no echoes, only the faint sound of the wind through the trees. Back in Brussels, Poirot received one last letter. The sender was Madame Fournier, who, following the events, had retired to live with a sister in Aix-en-Provence. The letter was short, but contained a sentence that Poirot read several times. We failed to see that what we all kept silent about was more deadly than any poison. Poirot slowly folded the letter and placed it in his personal file, in a folder marked Villa Orphée, confidential. That evening, in his apartment, Poirot lit his lamp and poured himself some tea. He trimmed his moustache in front of the mirror, adjusted his shirt cuffs, and took out his notebook. Wrote, "The crime at Villa Orphée was committed by a desperate man. But it was cultivated by many, by indifference, resentment, silent ambition, and delayed forgiveness. Every footstep that resonated that night was the result of a shared history. And the echo they heard wasn't of feet on marble. It was the echo of everything that was never said." He signed with an elegant stroke, H.P. Then he closed his notebook, leaned back in his favourite chair, and for the first time in a long time, allowed silence to settle in his home. A complete silence, without guilt, without a shadow, only peace. Darnay, and curiously, Claudine. The maid? Yes. It was Armand who asked her to have a copy, for security, as he put it. But she claims not to have used it that night. What if someone else did? Hastings remained thoughtful. Could someone have stolen the key, or borrowed it with some convincing excuse? Back at the house, Poirot called Claudine into the library. The young woman entered with her head bowed, but with an expression of resignation rather than fear. "Mademoiselle, allow me a simple question. Who used your key that night?" She swallowed. I didn't lend it, but I left it in the kitchen, hanging on its hook, and in the morning was he there? Yes, although it seemed to move a little, as if someone had thrown it back in a hurry. Thank you, that's all for now. When Claudine left, Poirot turned to Hastings with an faucheuse expression of suppressed satisfaction. The key was used and returned. Whoever took it didn't want to force doors or risk making noise. They wanted to appear invisible. That afternoon, Poirot decided to explore the suspect's private rooms again. With Delphine's permission, he examined Gabriel Darnay's room. In a wardrobe drawer, he found a blue silk handkerchief with a white border. It was of no apparent importance, except for a small reddish stain. Dried blood? Poirot murmured. In the fireplace, he also found still warm ashes. Scattered among them was a piece of paper with partially legible handwriting. It is a dangerous decision, but a necessary one. Poirot picked up the fragment with tweezers and placed it in an envelope. Then he inspected the adjoining bathroom. On a shelf, among the colognes and shaving creams, he discovered a small empty bottle with a cork stopper. It had no label, but the glass retained the same metallic aroma he had detected in Armand's study. And now the circle closes. At dusk, Poirot asked to speak privately with Madame Delphine. He found her on the terrace, with a blanket over, her legs and a book on her lap that she wasn't reading. "Did you know that Gabriel had a suspicious bottle in his possession?" he asked without preamble. "No, but I'm not surprised." Armand trusted him completely, which seemed absurd to me. "And then, did you ever think about killing him?" Delphine looked at him with cold, clear eyes. "We all think that, Monsieur Poirot, for a second. When someone you love reduces you to a shadow, crushes you with their will. Yes, it's easy to wish for their absence. But from that to making it a reality, there's a huge gap." Poirot nodded with a certain solemnity. "Crime isn't always born of hate. Sometimes it's born of fear, or wounded pride, or a truth that's impossible to face." "And have you found that truth?" Poirot bowed gently. "Almost. I just need one last piece." Back in his room, Poirot wrote a short list in his notebook. Key stolen and returned, planned act. Missing red scarf, scenic element. Poison in cognac weakness, prior to the blow. Mirror that. Shows unexpected presence. Portrait with figure in reflection. Changed will. Poirot closed his notebook and stood up with a determined expression. "Hastings, call everyone to the hall tomorrow morning. That will be the moment of truth. Have you solved the case yet? Yes. And as always, the key isn't what they said, but what they tried to hide." The killer thought he moved without leaving a trace, but he forgot that even the quietest footsteps echoed on Chapter 8, The Morning of Echoes. At 10 o'clock in the morning, everyone was gathered in the grand salon of Villa Orphée. The atmosphere was heavy, almost spectral. No one spoke. The curtains had been opened, and the dim light of the grey day spilled onto the tense faces of those present. Delphine, sitting with her hands clasped together, Lucien leaning back with a blank stare, Gabriel with his jaw rigid, and Madame Fournier standing like a wall of silence. Claudine, at Poirot's request, remained discreetly in a corner. Poirot entered leisurely, his shoes perfectly polished, and his walking stick in his hand, though he didn't need it. Hastings followed, carrying a tray containing a carefully selected assortment of objects: a blue handkerchief with white borders, an empty glass flask, a fragment of a partially burnt letter, and a copy of the amended will. "Thank you for your punctuality, ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, placing himself in the centre. "What I'm going to say now are not suppositions. They are conclusions. And these conclusions have been reached thanks to logic, psychology, and meticulous observation of the human soul." No one responded, not a blink. Poirot held up the burnt letter. "This fragment is from a letter written by Monsieur Valcourt. In it, he expressed his decision to change his will and warned that if anything happened to him, he should look in the portrait. The document was destroyed so that no one would know that the old will no longer had legal validity. Fortunately, Armand was more cunning than his murderer. He then showed the will found behind the painting. This document, dated 3 days before the crime, eliminated his nephew Lucien as the primary heir. The beneficiary was Gabriel Darnay. A surprising decision, perhaps, but a definitive one. Therefore, if Lucien had murdered his uncle to prevent this change, it would have been in vain. But since the will had already been signed, only someone, who knew about it and benefited from it, would have a real reason to silence Valcourt. Gabriel moved slightly, but Poirot ignored him for the moment. Now then, on the night of the crime, the study was opened with a key belonging to Claudine. She left it hanging in the kitchen as usual. Someone took it, entered the study, poured a substance into Armand's cognac, a substance also detected in this bottle found in Monsieur Darnay's room, and then discreetly returned the key. Gabriel stood up abruptly. "That's absurd, you think. I poisoned Armand with an undetectable substance, and then pushed him down the stairs." Poirot looked at him calmly. "No, you didn't push him. You weakened him. You left him vulnerable. The rest, Monsieur Darnay, was a little help from fate." But when he saw that Armand hadn't died immediately, he improvised. He placed the rosary in your hand, removed the red scarf you were wearing that night. Yes, the same one Claudine saw at the bottom of the stairs, and burned the letter that could incriminate him. "It's a lie. Lucien wrote it. He had reasons." Poirot turned to the young artist. "Monsieur Lucien, you made many mistakes. You concealed the fact that you were present after the fall. You painted a picture that unwittingly included the reflection of a witness. But your reaction was one of fear, not guilt. You didn't kill your uncle, but you did witness someone standing next to him, right after the crime." Lucien looked up, his face pale. "I didn't want to talk. I thought no one would believe me. I saw him, yes. I saw Gabriel kneeling beside the body, as if he were whispering something. Then he stood up, looked at the hall mirror, and left." Poirot nodded. "That mirror was key. It reflected the scene, and you unconsciously captured it in your painting. That blurred figure was Gabriel. His alibi was based on the silence of those afraid to speak." Gabriel clenched his fists. "Armand owed me that inheritance. I helped him when no one else would. I repaid his trust, and he gave it back to you. With the will, it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted control, redemption, applause. But redemption isn't achieved by force, monsieur. It's received, not taken." Gabriel collapsed into the armchair. No one moved. Only the distant ticking of the grandfather clock filled the air like a mournful metronome. Poirot turned to Delphine. "Mademoiselle, your intuition was correct from the start. Your brother didn't fall. He was driven by the ambition of someone who didn't accept forgiveness with humility, but with greed." Shortly after, the police arrived at the villa. Gabriel didn't say a word as he was arrested. His gaze was hollow, like that of a man who had lost more than an opportunity. He had lost his soul. On the terrace, Poirot and Hastings watched the lake as the wind raised small waves. "It all fell into place in the end, Poirot, but I confess, you almost fooled me. Ambition, Hastings, always leaves cracks, and in those cracks the echoes of truth eventually resonate. And what will you do now? Tea, perhaps, and a lemon truffle. The crime has been solved, but life goes on." Chapter 9. The Words That Silence Hid. Silence fell again at Villa Orphy after the police left. A thick silence, not of mystery, but of mourning. Not so much for Armand Valcourt's death, but for the exposure of the misery that had coexisted for years behind the house's perfect walls. Gabriel Darnay had been taken into custody, but what remained was not peace, but the echo of a crime that had broken more than a bond. It had exposed all the hidden fractures. Poirot remained in the library, standing in front of the portrait of the deceased. The will, the poison, the burned letter, the scarf, the painting. Everything had been revealed according to logic. But the detective didn't look satisfied. Hastings, who was watching him from a corner, frowned. "Aren't you happy, Poirot? The case has been solved, the culprit has been arrested, and, well, even Lucien has acknowledged his silence." Poirot turned his head slightly, without taking his eyes off the portrait. "Ah, my friend, yes. Everything fits together, apparently. But there's something that keeps bothering me." "What thing?" "Delphine's reaction. She was the first to hint that this wasn't an accident. She indirectly led us to revisit everything, and yet she never shed a tear for her brother. Not one." Hastings frowned. What if she just wasn't as attached to him as we thought? Poirot slowly shook his head. "That's possible. But it's also possible that Delphine had her own version of justice, one that doesn't require poison or prodding."